Thank you for joining Kandit News for the final installment of our three-part special series on the Alvendia corruption scandal. I'm Johnnie Rosario, and I'm bringing you this story because once, many years ago, I was where those defendants currently are. Many parts of the story are similar, but there's one stark contrast. When I stood in their shoes, I was actually guilty. Raymond Martinez and Juanita Moser are not drug dealers. Mixed with the fate of Mr. Alvendia, this is a story fit for a courtroom drama. It's a story of the power placed in one man by the political elite to corrupt the system and to manipulate our fears of the growing drug trade into a false sense of security by concealing its supply chain. The victims of this corruption? An innocent couple used to scapegoat the cover-up of Henry Alvendia's misdeeds. Hundreds of people who have gone to jail without ever being given the right to face their accusers or to spend one day in trial, and the integrity of the justice system itself. The search for the truth about police corruption on Guam and the fatal flaws of our justice system didn't end when Henry Alvendia's decade of decadence made way for his federal corruption conviction. He was no more remorseful of his crimes than a politician who apologized 21 times for a crime he now blames on everyone but himself. Instead of helping to root out corruption by offering up his boss, former Customs Chief Ralph Scambaluri, he offered up people who thought he was their friend. And instead of ending the cycle of police corruption by bringing down the fruit of its poisonous tree, he allowed it to flourish in the worst possible way. Henry Alvendia used his know-how as a corrupt cop to dupe friends and former colleagues who were on his case. He duped them to take their scent off of Ralph Scambaluri and from the actual trafficking of the majority of the drugs into this island. But it won't be enough for the terms of his plea agreement to simply say that there's nothing on Scambaluri. In order for Mr. Alvendia to secure his freedom from the consequences of his own corruption scandal, he decided to corrupt the system even more. So the corrupt cop didn't allow the scales of justice to rebalance. He led the government into framing and entrapping a couple into criminal activity that they never committed, a conspiracy they were not predisposed to plan without the crime's conspirators, the United States government itself, and the corrupt cop it is protecting. Now that the scales of justice await 12 citizens in a jury of Raymond Martinez and Juanita Moser's peers. Their second trial in what has been their 3-year nightmare ends with closing arguments by both the prosecution and the defense on Monday. Once Fred Brack finishes his rebuttal, Monday night, Judge Francis Tidinko Gatewood would hand the case over to those 12 citizens, each bringing with them a unique perspective of life on Guam. Each of them has a story. Perhaps some of them have been affected by substance abuse. Perhaps some of them have been victims of corruption or abuse of police power. Maybe some of them have been falsely accused of something. Whatever the case, all 12 of them have sat in that jury box, listening intently as the evidence was presented. Many times, it's what's left unsaid that may have the greatest impact. And in this case, 2 crucial points of evidence never made it to them. What's worse is that lies were entered into evidence. The jury's job is now that much harder. Before finding guilt or reasonable doubt to convict, there are certain questions where they need to weigh the evidence they have. They need to determine whether some of the witnesses were lying based on testimonies given. They have to figure out who is telling the truth about where the plan to import meth all began. Most of those questions were raised in what's called a pretrial motions conference. It's like a trial, and it happens in court with the judge seated in front. The difference is there's no jury. The pretrial conference happened before the jury was selected. And to be precise, most of the pretrial motions were answered before the second trial. Before any motions were entered, Judge Gatewood told both parties that they didn't need to submit the constitutional questions answered in the first trial's pre-trial conference. She automatically forwarded those rulings into the second trial without hearing any arguments. Constitutional questions were raised, mostly by the defendants. to answer whether the case should proceed to trial at all, and if it does, exactly what evidence will the jury be allowed to hear and see? The answers stem from the judge determining whether there's a preponderance of proof that the defendant's constitutional rights were violated any time between the moment the defendant became a suspect to the time the defendant is indicted by the grand jury. In United States versus Raymond Martinez and Juanita Moser, it's really hard to determine when and where everything began in this case until you have the benefit of hearing an entire trial and what law enforcement reveals about their investigation. In United States versus Raymond Martinez and Juanita Moser, it's really hard to determine when and where everything began in this case until you have the benefit of hearing an entire trial and what law enforcement reveals about their investigation. Based on the 2 trials that have passed, here are the undisputed facts. First, U.S. versus Martinez and Moser has its origins in 2 separate Homeland Security investigations, or HSI cases, both seemingly unrelated to drugs. The first HSI investigation had nothing to do with Mr. Martinez or Ms. Moser. It was led primarily by HSI Special Agent Erwin Farron. This is the federal case against Mr. Alvendia and his customs co-defendants in the corruption scandal. That case stemmed from a December 16, 2010 incident. It culminated into a sealed plea agreement signed May 12, 2015 between then U.S. Attorney Alicia Limtiaco and defendant Mr. Alvendia. On May 12, 2015, Mr. Alvendia became a convicted felon and was preparing to meet Mr. Martinez and Ms. Moser for a 3rd time in the entrapment of that couple. The second case was led by HSI Special Agent Erful Mataguihan, and it started July 29, 2014. This was the day Mr. Martinez made a declaration at Los Angeles International Airport that he was carrying $100,000 in cash from Guam. He carried a receipt to account for the origins of that money. HSI became suspicious of the sum, so Mr. Mataguihan opened a case on the matter. Number 2. Secondly, aside from the secondary searches whenever Mr. Martinez and Ms. Moser would travel, searches that revealed nothing but one consistent story, that Mr. Martinez sold a collector's luxury car that he had repaired and brought the money from Guam to the United States mainland. Agents never found any drugs, drug paraphernalia, not even so much as circumstantial evidence of any crime whatsoever. All the agents testified to this under oath. Third, on April 28, 2015, the party ended for Henry Alvendia. His childhood friend, HSI Special Agent Erwin Farron, together with FBI Special Agent Gary Hewitt, brought Mr. Alvendia into a meeting, showed him footage of Mr. Alvendia committing acts of corruption, and informed Mr. Alvendia that he would be indicted. Mr. Alvendia agreed then and there, according to his testimony, and that of Mr. Farron, that he would begin cooperating as an agent for the federal government. Fourth, on April 29, 2015, a day later, a District Court of Guam grand jury returned a true bill against Mr. Alvendia and 8 co-defendants in what would be known as the largest police corruption case in Guam's history, the customs corruption scandal. The indictment and subsequent filings indicate Mr. Alvendia as the head of the racket. Judge Gatewood sealed the indictment immediately, and it was not made public until months later. Fifth, as of the day of the indictments, witness testimonies and comments during trial proceedings by Assistant U.S. Attorney Fred Black indicate that neither Mr. Martinez nor Ms. Moser were the subject of any investigation having to do with the customs corruption scandal. The focus was Mr. Scambaluri. Sixth, on either April 28, 29, or 30, or May 1st, Mr. Alvendia first raised Mr. Martinez and Ms. Moser's names. It was on this day that the government shifted its focus in the customs corruption case from Mr. Scambaluri. Actually, that's precisely where that case ends. Mr. Alvendia was the furthest up they would go in uncovering whatever there was to uncover. On this day, the focus became the couple. 7th, on the evening of May 1st, 2015, Mr. Alvendia succeeded in contacting the couple over the phone to deploy the scheme directed by the federal government. The scheme was to pretend he needed his scooter serviced. Mr. Martinez was working at the former Scooter World in Tumon during this time. This phone conversation was the first of several communications under surveillance by the federal government. In it, Mr. Alvendia is heard asking Ms. Moser if she recalls the topic he last introduced in the last face-to-face conversation he and the couple had in late 2012 or early 2013. The topic he was talking about, by his own admission, was the importation of meth from California using rock salts to conceal the drug. Prior to the jury hearing this part of the tape, Mr. Alvendia and Mr. Black had told them that this unrecorded 2012 conversation was the proof that the conspiracy began with the couple. Ms. Moser, if heard in the phone recording, say to Mr. Alvendia that they can discuss that matter when they meet at Scooter World the next day. 8th, on May 2nd, 2015, Mr. Alvendia recorded video and audio of his meeting with the couple outside Scooter World before Mr. Martinez leaves to grab a part for the scooter's repair. And Mr. Alvendia and Ms. Moser moved their meeting to a nearby coffee shop, Frostbite. It was in this meeting where Mr. Alvendia reveals his desire and excitement to have the couple join him in his plan to import meth to Guam, concealed by rock salts. 9th, the subsequent meetings are held May 5th, May 12th, and May 22nd, where the three continued on their planning. The plan would culminate a location to be set in Torrance, California, where the defendants would exchange something with Mr. Alvendia. 10th, on May 26th, the couple leaves Guam and arrives in Los Angeles, California for a series of events, including the planning of their wedding in Las Vegas, Nevada. This was a trip that was planned and paid for prior to the May 1st, 2015 initial conversation with Mr. Alvendia. 11th, on June 3rd, the case agents on this case began coordinating with local police department support for the entrapment to take hold. HSI Los Angeles case agent Matt Hernandez calls his friend in the Torrance Police Department to ensure a unit will pull over the van the couple will be driving en route to their meeting with Mr. Alvendia. A separate coordination is made to ensure a canine drug unit also will respond to the traffic stop. 12. On June 4th, after a series of phone calls to plan where the couple would meet Mr. Alvendia within the LA County city of Torrance, the couple is pulled over by two Torrance police officers, Officer Ryan Schmitz and Officer Anthony Kraft. At some point, they have the couple exit the van and sit at the curb. 13. It is unclear what time he arrives, but Redondo Beach police officer Daniel Ritchie and his drug detection dog arrive at the scene by Officer Smith's request for a canine unit, and he deploys his dog. 14. The dog sniffs around and inside the open windows of the van and does not make an alert to the odor of narcotics until he arrives at the driver's side rear wheel well and begins scratching aggressively at the undercarriage of the van. 15th, a black metal device, later identified as a GPS tracker, then falls to the ground. 16th, all the details of this event that go between the events described here and the details of the event after the tracker falls are in dispute or are unknown, except that the couple is arrested and not told why. They are charged in Eastern District Court of Southern California. Those charges are dropped, and they are indicted by the grand jury in the District Court of Guam. 17th, they return to Guam and they begin what would become a 3-year journey for their freedom and reputation. The couple was on trial earlier this year for the 2 main charges of the indictment. The first accusation is that the couple conspired to import meth from California to Guam. The second accusation is that they possessed more than 50 grams of meth when they were pulled over in Torrance. This is where the disputed sections in this timeline come into play for the jury's deliberations. These are the disputed portions of the evidence. First, the GPS tracker that was placed on the van by Mr. Hernandez must have had the strong odor of methamphetamine on it. If the jury is to accept that, then the drug detection dog accurately pinpointed the source of the odor. Second, there were only 3 officers of the law who responded to this supposed bust of an alleged 8 pounds of dope. Only 3. Of those 3, the jury heard the witness testimony of the arresting officer, Mr. Smits, and the canine handler, Mr. Ritchie. Their descriptions of the container where dope allegedly was found, the placement of those containers, how those containers were handled, whether the contents were poured out onto the pavement, and onto who had custody of the so-called evidence from the time Officer Ritchie left the scene to the time the evidence was handed off to another officer. All are different. Mr. Smith's testimony alone is riddled with inconsistencies and direct contradictions of Mr. Ritchie's testimony, even his own testimony during different periods when he testified or was deposed. Third, the DEA chemist who tested the so-called evidence admitted that there was no way of knowing whether the substance he tested was tampered with, as it was revealed that the chain of custody for the evidence was broken in several key places, and that the evidence supposedly changed hands 6 times. Fourth, although Mr. Black and Mr. Alvendia swore to the jury that the idea to import meth concealed in rock salts originated with the couple, a tape recording of the May 2nd, 2015 initial meeting among Mr. Alvendia and Ms. Moser clearly demonstrates the idea came from Mr. Alvendia himself. The prosecution fought against the admittance of the tape into evidence, telling the jury that the background noise from the venue where they met corrupted the ability for the jury to hear what was said. When the tape was played, Judge Gatewood asked the jury if they understood, and they all agreed that they could, loud and clear. These are the disputed portions of the evidence that the jury must weigh. If the jury agrees that the defendants, that the drug detection dog did pinpoint the correct source of narcotic odor on the GPS tracker and nowhere within the van they were driving, and if they agree that too much is left to wonder based on the missing pieces in the chain of custody, then it will behoove them to deliver a not guilty verdict on the possession charge. If the jury sides with the defendants that the recording on May 2nd, 2015 meeting clearly shows that it was the government, through Mr. Alvendia and not the defendants, who came up with the conspiracy, then one of these 2 tests would be proven to free the couple from the conspiracy charge. The test makes up half of what the defense needs to prove in order to succeed in its entrapment defense. An entrapment defense is presented to a jury when the defendants believe that they were set up by the government to commit a crime they would never have committed without the government creating all the conditions for the crime and inducing their complicity. Showing that the idea came from the government and understanding how Mr. Alvendia navigated the planning of the conspiracy qualifies the defendants through the second test of the entrapment defense. The first test is in the air, though and completely up to the jury in determining who they think is lying, Mr. Alvendia or the couple. A key piece of evidence has never been presented to the jury in this regard, and that is the expert testimony of world-renowned former DEA agent Mike Levine, who has testified as an expert on a wide range of criminal matters over 200 times in federal courts throughout the nation. He was retained by the defense for the first trial, but his opportunity to testify was abruptly cut by Judge Gatewood while he was on the plane headed to Guam for this trial. Mr. Levine was to introduce into evidence a known phenomenon common to officers of the law entrapping unsuspecting civilian co-conspirators. It is called criminal braggadocio. In the tapes subsequent to the May 2nd recording, the defendants are heard becoming more excited about their plan. As a matter of fact, without the May 2nd tapes being played, it may sound like the defendants were behind the plan. According to the criminal braggadocio theory, civilians who have never been before predisposed to such a matter of criminality become more bold and almost arrogant about the plan that the undercover agent has designed. They mimic normal patterns of human behavior in similar settings, where testosterone and pride naturally set in. Mr. Levine was to testify that the behavior of the couple was a classic case of criminal braggadocio. The evidence, had the jury heard it, understood it, and believed it, would have qualified the defendants through the first part of the entrapment defense to prove that they were not predisposed to the crime. And it makes sense. These people aren't drug dealers, and Levine was prepared to say that in his expert opinion. And believe me, I have expert opinion on this matter as well. Raymond Martinez and Juanita Moser are not drug dealers. I've never heard their names on the streets, and aside from this trial, no one will ever hear their names in that context. The second crucial piece of evidence that the jury in the second trial never heard goes to the heart of the crime scene in Torrance itself. The defense's expert witness on GPS tracking, Teddy Estrelado, testified in the first trial that it was mathematically impossible for the couple to have been driving above 41 miles per hour during the time Officer Smits tailed them on Pacific Coast Highway. Remember, the reason Officer Smits pulled the couple over to begin with, or at least the reason he gave, was that the couple was speeding at 52 miles per hour in a 45 miles per hour zone. Mr. Estrelado was to testify that according to simple math, after plotting the GPS data, there was no way Officer Smits was telling the truth. For a reason unknown to anyone but the attorneys in the case, Judge Gatewood did not allow Mr. Estrelado to testify that in this trial. She deprived the jury of the key piece of evidence. The suppression of this evidence goes hand in hand with the questions of constitutional law Judge Gatewood made in the first trial's pre-trial motions conference that carried into the second trial. The fact that the GPS tracker was placed on the couple's van rental without a warrant, the lack of probable cause to search the van and their home in Tamuning, and the motion to dismiss based on clear entrapment of the couple. All these motions were denied by the judge, leaving those questions of law for the jury to decide, but not before handicapping the defense's ability to raise these as defense for the jury to consider. So that the search for the truth is still happening, and it faces a new frontier of American justice system floating further and further from its founding. The jury will ponder many questions and sometimes will hit dead ends because of the missing links in the evidence trail suppressed from them. In this search for the truth in this matter, it is critical that the jury of our peers do what should be natural to this generation of ours. Question what doesn't make sense. It should be our hope that they base their choices and verdicts on reason. This jury of peers is a microcosm of the struggle, not with conscience, but with confidence, that people around my age had to move beyond. But what they likely will do this week sets them apart from the rest of us in situations where the stakes are high, based on countless thousands of pages of discovery that they will never see. They will begin their memory of the case presented by both the prosecution and the defense on Tuesday. And then they will deliver a verdict that one way or the other will have a real and lasting effect on two very real, very living, breathing human beings whose young daughters are depending on their freedom. What I hope is that they can recognize the noise that litters the recollection of dishonest testimony by government witnesses. I hope they are as we raise ourselves to be, suspicious of the company lying everywhere. I hope their suspicion leads to discussion and debate, and eventually the rejection of what the prosecution is trying to sell them. The irony for this all-powerful government is that for as many sheriff badges they can flash in front of every lie and cover story and conspiracy is that the power to determine whether they're full of it or whether an innocent couple can get their freedom back rests with that jury, not the government. For as many flaws as mindless traditions may bring, the jury trial is a beautiful bedrock upon which this country always has rested, Lady Justice's scale. It is the great equalizer. For Raymond Martinez and Juanita Moser, the conscience of each of those 12 deciders couldn't be more important. In a nutshell, I hope each of them maintains confidence against the pretentious and intimidating expectations of the prosecutor and the federal agents sent there to keep an eye on the jury. I hope that as they deliberate the facts of the case in its totality, to include all those times they were shuffled out of the room so that the court could conceal evidence or other critical discussion, will provide the reason that brings them to collective judgment of not guilty. Reasonable doubt is written in what should be struck through sentences of the indictment. And it isn't just that this couple is not guilty. If this jury is the representation of Caesar's version of St. Peter, the official who decides worthiness to lurk in the dark or enter the light, then this jury has the historic opportunity to begin the indictment of all that is wrong with the criminal justice system and send agents of its corruption to its perdition. Martinez and Moser are not guilty. In order for the scales to balance, one more fact must be true. The criminal here is the government. In this case, nothing else but that is certain. For Kandit News, I'm Johnnie Rosario. Thank you for joining us for this final installment of the Alvendia corruption scandal. From our studios in Jigo, I bid you, buenas noches, de mañana si Dios, because at Kandit, the light illuminates the way to the truth. Good night.